Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to, of course, Secretary of State Colin Powell. Colonel Wilkerson, welcome to the Young Turks.
Glad to be here. Glad to be here.
Really glad to have you here. I want to start at the beginning here, Colonel. And when you've been with Colin Powell for a long, long time in your career, when he asked you to become his Chief of Staff at the State Department, how'd you feel about working for the Bush administration and working for Colin Powell in that context?
I'm a Republican, so I didn't have any problem working for a Republican administration. By that time, August of 2002, I did have concerns about this particular Republican administration because it looked extremely unilateral, it looked extremely arrogant, and it looked as if it was operating in a way antithetical to the way it had talked about during campaigning and during the first confirmation testimony series for the ministers and so forth. They talked about humility. They talked about achieving a balance of power in the world that favored freedom and phrases like that. So I didn't have any problem, but my main allegiance, I'll admit right out, my main allegiance was to the man whom I'd worked for so many years and whom I kind of looked at as an African-American version of Dwight Eisenhower, Colin Powell. That was my principal reason for working in the administration.
Now, once you got inside the administration, what was your first warning sign, if you remember it, where you thought, whoa, now this is really out of bounds here?
Well, you know, you may find this interesting or not, I don't know. I'm a soldier of 31 years, and I found the incredible arrogance and lack of humility of the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, to be stunning almost right off the bat. I was charged by Ambassador Haas, who is Richard Haas, who's now the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, but was my boss then, to start what George Kennan and George Marshall had done many years before, talks between the military joint staff and the State Department's policy planning staff, and I did that immediately. Within a month or two, the military had to back away from it, and I finally got the reason out of one of the colonels with whom we'd been meeting. He said, Rumsfeld had essentially said, you meet with anybody from the State Department, you're dead. So, I mean, this was an incredibly arrogant man who took upon himself the power of the entire interagency group, with the Vice President's blessing, of course, and did everything he could to cut the State Department and, for that matter, other members of the President's cabinet out of any serious deliberation.
Well, the obvious question becomes how, because as we see now in GQ's article about Don Rumsfeld, he would often just not carry out orders, even given by the President, whether it was about Hurricane Katrina or other matters. Now, normally, of course, the Secretary of Defense would not be allowed to get away with this. How was Rumsfeld allowed to carry on his own policies within the White House?
I think that's an excellent question. I think it's a question historians will be asking for years to come. The finger has to point at the President of the United States, I think, and to a certain extent at his National Security Advisor, Dr. Rice. She, for not disciplining the statutory decision-making system centered on the National Security Council, which is one of her chief responsibilities, and he for not helping her, because it's really almost impossible for the National Security Advisor to do it if the President is not behind the National Security Advisor, and I just don't believe the President was. I believe he was too detached, and into that detachment flowed the Vice President, who was anything but detached, and, you know, I'd use Robert Dallack's phrase for Kissinger-Nixon. Cheney was co-president. I'd go further than that and say that for national security issues and other critical issues, Cheney was the president.
So, Colonel Wilkerson, walk us through that, because people say that a lot, but we weren't there, and so it's a little hard to imagine how that happens. How was he co-president or in charge? Would you guys have meetings and the Vice President would simply just command the meetings and give the orders, or would he do it in a way where the President simply didn't even understand he wasn't making the decisions?
A little both. I think it's fair to say that Dick Cheney is one of the most adept bureaucratic entrepreneurs I've ever seen, and he was paired with another one who was pretty good, but not as good as him, Donald Rumsfeld. And those two knew every way in the book to stymie what I call the statutory process, the legislative decision-making process. Now let me give you some examples. On North Korea, for example, every time Colin Powell and Jim Kelly, the Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific, wanted to open some meaningful talks with the North Koreans, either through the six-party process or through bilateral talks, Dick Cheney would step in and cut it off. But he wouldn't cut it off as the vice president. He would get the last bite at the apple in the Oval Office alone with the president, and he would talk the president into cutting it off. On Iran, he did it in an entirely different way. We never produced a national security decision document on Iran policy. That gave Dick Cheney, by default, what he wanted, which was no talks at all with the regime in Tehran. So all he had to do there was to make sure, as you just pointed out, that the right people didn't come to the meetings, that they didn't come prepared, that they weren't well briefed, or they appeared to be not well briefed. We called it the rope-a-dope policy. And that way he got the procedures in the statutory process to never produce a decision, which is exactly what he wanted. No decision, then there would be no talks. On other issues, I think Bart Gellman in his book Angler has been very astute in pointing out some of the ways that Cheney got domestic issues that he was in favor of. The one that Bart points out very vividly is that Bush wanted 2 or 3 things done with regard to domestic taxes, and Cheney wanted more than that done. Bush told him no, so Cheney goes over, strong-arms the Congress, gets the Congress to give the president the couple of things that he wanted, and the couple of things that Cheney wanted. The president couldn't veto the bill because he'd be vetoing what he wanted. Ergo, Cheney got everything he wanted. So this was an incredibly astute man operating with a guy who'd never been in the federal government before, and I must say was pretty much detached from the details.
Well, Colonel Wilkerson, as I hear you tell that story, I think you're being gentle. There comes a point where you have to say that guy just wasn't that bright, that he couldn't figure out any of this.
Well, I'll let you say that.
All right. Now, one thing before we proceed, you mentioned rope-a-dope. Can you flesh that out a little bit for us? What's rope-a-dope?
Well, it's kind of, you come to the meetings, the meetings of the National Security Council, or the meetings directly below that, what we call the principals meetings, or even the deputies meetings, which is the third level, and you don't come with the primary. That is to say, if it's a principals meeting, Rumsfeld doesn't show up. You send someone who's representing you but not empowered to make decisions, not briefed in on the material necessary to make the decision, so you've just stymied the process. Or you show up yourself and you throw tons of paper on the table and you say, oh, God, I'm so busy, I haven't had a chance to read anything, I need to read all this, I can't make any decisions until I've read all this. You've just stymied the process again. And when your 800-pound gorillas doing that, like Colin Powell and Condi Rice and Donald Rumsfeld, and the president doesn't step in the middle of it and say, stop this, or I'll fire you. I mean, it's pretty much that simple. It doesn't get said that way, but it's that simple. Or the chief of staff, in this case Andy Card, doesn't step in and say the same thing and then back it up with the president if the principal doesn't believe him, then you're going to have that happen all the time. And unfortunately, that's kind of what happened. Richard Haas covers this pretty well in his new book, which is just out, called War of Necessity, War of Choice.
Well, it seems to come back to the same issue, that you have a weak, ineffectual, and not altogether that bright leader who is not putting an end to this nonsense. But you don't want to say that on air, and I get that. So I want to move on to what broke the camel's back for you. We're talking to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Chief of Staff for Colin Powell. At what point did you say, well, all right, look, we've had a lot of these things that I thought were out of bounds, but this really does it for me. I can't go on.
Well, in April of 2004, I believe it was, Powell came through the door to our offices. We had adjoining offices, and he said, he just dropped a bombshell on me. He said, we're going to have some photos come out from a place called Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And these photos are going to really be bad. They're going to show abuse of detainees, and I want you to get to the bottom of this. I want you to develop a chronology. I want to know how we got there. I put my lawyer, my legal advisor, William H. Taft IV, on the legal aspects. I want you and Will to work together. And so I began compiling a dossier of classified and unclassified documents. I began looking into the armed forces involvement in this. I began looking into the CIA and contractor involvement. And by the time we got to the election in 2004, I had put together quite a stack of papers, and I'd begun to put a chronology and how did we get here analysis together. By the time I left in January 2005, and I saw that although Rumsfeld had offered to resign, hearings had been held, and so forth, I saw that no real accountability was achieved. The accountability that was achieved was with soldiers basically at at the point of the spear, sergeants and enlisted men and a few others. And so I began to go around to the war colleges, and I was a military officer. I didn't want to speak out publicly. I went around to the war colleges and the intermediate colleges and such, and I talked with soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen. And I thought that when I would talk about these things, I would get a lot of pushback. Instead of getting pushback, I got confirmation. I got people taking me into the hallways and into the corridors and telling me, you don't know the half of it. Let me tell you about what's going on. And so this all built up until October 2005, and I just had to come to Jesus with myself, if you will. My wife pointed some things out to me about my loyalty to my country outweighing my loyalty to an administration or any particular man or whatever. And it got to be too much for me, so I started speaking out publicly.
Colonel Wilkerson, if you believe it is torture, and what happened at Abu Ghraib is connected to the memos that were written at the White House, what should be done about it?
That's an excellent question, too. I'd like to say that we got two choices. We either release all those people we put in jail or reprimanded or injured their careers down at the lower end, or we leave them where they are and we go after the people who directed them to do the kinds of things that they did. But that's the good citizen in me speaking. The realist in me, the cynic in me, looks at our process and our government and says we don't have the political will to do this. And even if we had the political will, we don't have the political skill to carry it out. And I think the President Obama, is recognizing that to a certain extent in the stance that he's taken towards this. It just, with so many other challenges on his plate, so many other things that are just vastly more important to do than perhaps this is. I'm not trying to denigrate its importance, but I'm just saying that the financial and economic crisis we confront, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, and so forth, probably outweigh it in terms of energy devoted to challenges. Wow. I understand why he's saying what he's saying. I don't like it as a citizen, and it doesn't make me feel good about my democratic republic not being able to correct itself and to shine its light on the dirty places. But I just don't believe we've got the will and the skill to do it.
Let me go to the good citizen, Colonel Wilkerson. If you had it your way and we were going to operate this democracy as we should, how far up would this go? Would it go to the Secretary of Defense? Would it go to Vice President Cheney? Would it go to President Bush? And what would you do about it?
I don't think there's any question it goes to Cheney. And I think I'm increasingly of a mind that a lot of it goes to Cheney and stops there. Not just because of the President's disinclination to do detail, but I also think Cheney kept some things from the President. And what would I do about it? I think that the best way to deal with this probably would be to have a similar group to that we had for the 9/11 Commission. And by that I mean it would be not congressionally mandated, it would not be presidentially mandated, it would be co-mandated by both the President and the Congress. It would be comprised of people that almost everyone can recognize have integrity, have high character, and those people would be given marching orders, and they would take whatever time was necessary, have access to everything, and their deliberations would be more or less final. Of course, they're not just like the 9/11 Commission going to please everyone, but at least that will tamp it down. The President will be able to get on with the challenges that are more serious right now. And when this commission delivers its results, I think we'll have some catharsis. We'll have some epiphany. Everyone won't like it, but at least we will have examined it thoroughly, and the people who did the examination will be credible people.
Is that enough? If the commission says yes, laws were broken, and the person who ordered that
they should have what I would call reference authority. In other words, they should be able to turn it over to the appropriate authorities for prosecution, and a recommendation should be rendered with that if they believe laws were broken and they believe the proper authorities ought to take action.
Dick Cheney seemed to have an equivocal answer on Face the Nation when asked, did the President know about this abuse? And he said, well, I think he should have known, or something along those lines. Is there some chance that Dick Cheney just flat out gave the orders and didn't tell the President?
Absolutely. In my mind, I have no problem believing that. I have no problem at all believing that.
All right. Now, of all the different abuses, which one do you think was the worst? Whether it's torture, warrantless wiretapping, arresting U.S. citizens like Padilla and stripping them of all of their rights, the invasion of Iraq based on false evidence. I mean, we got a litany to choose from. What would you say was the one that you thought was most egregious?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I think the ones we ought to deal with are the ones where there is a possibility that U.S. and international laws were broken. The others, the war of choice, as Richard Haas has so aptly called it, that's something that I think we all are to blame for. The Congress voted by wider margins to give the president the right to do that than they did for the first Gulf War. In fact, a very, very wide margin the Congress voted by. If you ask me which one was the most egregious, I think I'd probably have to point at Iraq, because after all, we've probably killed somewhere between, the DOD admits 100,000, I'd say it's more like 250,000 Iraqis. We've clearly are approaching 5,000 with American and coalition deaths. All of this for what? We have a complete mess. The surge working is almost laughable. The surge, first of all, took advantage of conditions that were already extant on the ground and expanded and deepened them, conditions created largely by the Iraqis. In other words, they'd finished their ethnic cleansing. They had finished making their plays for political power, Sadr, for example. And Petraeus and his surge came in and simply took advantage of that, and to their credit, and deepened and expanded it. But the political problems that were supposed to be solved while this surge was establishing more stability have not been solved. They still do not have an oil revenue sharing law. They still have not tackled Kirkuk. The Kurds are ever more encroaching on Arab territory. Everyone is just waiting for the United States to get down to a level where it is no longer a viable referee, and then they're going to go at it again. Meanwhile, Iran is sitting there in the south licking its chops, pretty much having taken over the south of Iran.
Colonel Wilkerson, we would love to have you back on the program. We're out of time for today, but we really appreciate you coming on the Young Turks talking with us.